We continue in the book of Judges this morning. We are in Judges chapter 12, just starting that, ready to start in verse 1. And it says, Then the men of Ephraim gathered together, crossed over towards Zaphon, and said to Jephthah, Why did you cross over to fight against the people of Ammon and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house down on you with fire. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen the tension between some of the tribes over this very thing. Some went to battle and others didn't, and they were upset about that. Some didn't go to battle, and Deborah called them out as a result of that for not coming and helping. And so here's another issue that we don't know what the motivation is behind this, whether it's jealousy or envy or whatever the case may be. I just don't suppose it matters what the case is, but rather than just complain, they're threatening physical violence against Jephthah and his followers. And Jephthah responds, said to him, My people and I were in a great struggle with the people of Ammon. And when I called you, you did not deliver me out of their hands. So that adds to the story a little bit, doesn't it? They're saying you didn't call us. He said, I called you and you didn't come and deliver them out of my hands. So when I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hands and crossed over against the people of Ammon, and the Lord delivered them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me? And so again, there's this back and forth with Ephraim, and that should have been the end of it. They should have been able to say, okay, yeah, we've got this all worked out, we've got it all figured out, but that's not the case here. And Jephthah gathered together all the men of Gilead and fought against Ephraim. And the men of Gilead defeated Ephraim because they said, Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites. The Gileadites seized the fords of the Jordan before the Ephraimites arrived. And when the Ephraimite who escaped said, Let me cross over, the men of Gilead would say to him, Are you an Ephraimite? And if he said no, then they would say to him, Then say Shibboleth. And he would say Sibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. Then they would take him and kill him at the fords of the Jordan, and there fell at that time 42,000 Ephraimites. Something about their speech pattern did not allow them to say the sh sound, and that was how they were caught when they went through, because they couldn't say that. And if they had been who they said they were, then they would have been able to say that. So again, the dynamic in Israel isn't what it ought to be right now. The tribes are feuding with each other and fighting with each other. They are back and forth between being faithful to God and being unfaithful to God. And so this is not a pretty time for the history of Israel. And unfortunately, there's going to be a lot more of this throughout the book of Judges. There'll be issues with this even during the Kings. There'll be issues with this even after the Kings, after they come back from Babylonian captivity. And so it was, I think the root of that is what we just said. They weren't following God, and that's why they were getting into all this trouble. They just weren't doing what he told them to do, weren't letting him be the king and guide, and as a result, they were acting, well, what does the phrase say? Everyone was doing what was right in their own sight. And so that's what the problem we're seeing Israel have right now. And Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried among the cities of Gilead. And so an interesting segment. We talked about Jephthah's foolish vow, as we called it. Unfortunately, we couldn't come up with an answer as to why he made that vow. And we didn't come up with a good answer for did he carry out that vow as he said he would. Text seems to indicate that maybe he did. And others would say no, it was a symbolic thing, that she just remained a perpetual virgin all of her life. But a lot of people think just the opposite. Yeah, he did what he had promised he would do. And so, unfortunately, I know we'd all like to have an answer to that question, but there's just not one to be found because Scripture just doesn't give us that information. After him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons, and he gave away $30 in marriage and brought in $30 from elsewhere for his sons. He judged Israel 7 years, and Ibzan died and was buried at Bethlehem. And again, here's one of those 1, 2, 3 verses given to a judge. We know nothing about what happened during his judgeship other than, again, whoever wrote Judges enjoyed telling us about the 30s the sons and daughters and donkeys and cities and all of that. And there must have been some significance to that. So I don't know what that would be and what it would mean for us today, but I find that kind of interesting that's how he's remembered, because he had 30 sons, gave away 30 daughters. That's 60 kids. That's a lot of people.
They don't talk about one wife either.
Yeah, no, they don't talk about one wife either. I pray he didn't have just one wife. That would have been hard on her. And after him, Elon the Zebulunite judged Israel. He judged Israel 10 years. And Elon the Zebulunite died and was buried at Aijalon in the country of Zebulun. So another one of those. We know who he is. We know where he's from, where he died, but that's all we know about him. After him, Abdon the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode 70 young donkeys. He judged Israel 8 years. Then Abdon the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, died and was buried in Pirathon in the land of Ephraim in the mountains of the Amalekites. So again, just this list of those judges, we know who they are. We know precious few details about them, and that's all we can say about them. And then we get to chapter 13. Again, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Didn't see that one coming, did you? And the Lord delivered them in the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. And that's a long time, isn't it? And the Philistines, of course, play a prominent role in the history of Israel. This is kind of some of the earlier mentions of them in this particular time, but they will be a thorn in the side of Israel for a long time. Now there was a certain man from Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Indeed, now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now therefore please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, not to eat anything unclean, for behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. And no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. So, again, this oft-repeated issue of barrenness among some of the women of Israel is interesting. And God seems to always use that to his benefit. Of course, Sarah was barren, and we have all those issues in there. And so God can use that and demonstrate his power that even a woman as old as Sarah was could have children. If God saw fit to see that happen. So here's another one. And she had no children. But an angel came to her and said, You shall conceive and bear a son. But there was a condition on this. He's going to be what they call a Nazarite. She wasn't to drink wine or similar drink, eat anything unclean, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God. I grew up in the time when long hair was popular among young men. You remember that time? And I always kind of wished that I had been a Nazarite, because I always wanted to have long hair, and my dad said, not in this lifetime. At least not while you're under my care. You're not going to have long hair. And I didn't. But it's interesting that was the physical representation of what showed that he was a Nazarite was his hair. No razor shall ever come upon the head, for the child shall be a Nazarite. And we can back up, and we will look at the Nazarites back all the way to Numbers chapter 6 is where the law of the Nazarites is given. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When either a man or a woman consecrates an offering to take the vow of a Nazarite, to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and similar drink. He shall drink neither vinegar made from the wine, nor vinegar made from similar drink, neither shall he drink any grape juice or eat fresh grapes or raisins. All the days of his separation he shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine from seed to skin. So, what does it seem that like a Nazarite was? And why would somebody choose to be a Nazarite?
Words separate, and there are several times.
Okay. Separate himself to the Lord there in verse 2. So it was an acknowledgement or a decision made on the part of that man or woman could be either one, to separate themselves to the service of the Lord. Now, what that service was, text really doesn't tell us what that is, other than he was consecrated to the Lord. Probably not in the sense of being at the tabernacle, because that was the priest's responsibility. They did those things at the tabernacle and later in the temple. So whatever the cause was here, here's a person who said, I'm going to dedicate myself for serving the Lord. And you notice it says there in verse 4, all the days of his separation he shall eat nothing. The Nazirite vow was something you entered into, and if you wanted to, you could leave it. It wasn't something that was a lifelong commitment for you. What's different with Samson, though, is what? Yeah, he got his hair, but what's different about Samson being a Nazirite, Jim?
From the womb.
From the womb, okay? He didn't have a choice. He wasn't given that choice. God said, you will be a Nazirite. And your mom has to not eat these certain things while she's carrying you, and then he's going to be bound by these obligations through his time. And so that's different in that context. Renetta? I can't think. Oh, okay. Yeah. Does anybody remember a New Testament Nazirite? My mind is failing me, which happens all the time. Well, homework assignment for this week, and we'll figure it out next week. He goes on to say, all the days of the vow of his separation, no razor shall come upon his head until the days are fulfilled for which he separated himself to the Lord, he shall be holy. So again, separated himself for a time, whatever that time frame was, but he's going to be holy to the Lord as a result of that. Then he shall let his locks of his hair of his head grow. All the days that he separates himself to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body. He shall not make himself unclean, even for his father or his mother, for his brother or his sister, when they die, because his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation shall be holy to the Lord. And so we've got, don't cut hair, nothing, absolutely nothing to do with the grape in any way, shape, form, or fashion, juiced or otherwise. Don't have that. Don't go near a dead body. And why was that? What happened when you went near a dead body under the old law? You were unclean. You were impure. And there was a ritual for that. But under the laws of the Nazirite, no, that's something you just can't do. If your father dies, if your mother dies, if your brother dies, your sister dies, you can't have anything to do with that. Because you will be messing with your separation, if you will. You won't be holy in that sense. And if anyone dies very suddenly beside him, and he defiles his consecrated head, then he shall shave his head on the day of his cleansing. On the seventh day he shall shave it. So even if you're walking along and some guy walking beside you drops dead, too bad. You're violated. You have violated your code, even though it wasn't an overt act on the part of the person, but it did violate the law that God had set for that. And he had to shave his head. In other words, start over with being a Nazirite. Because then, on the 8th day, shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons to the priest, to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and the priest shall offer one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, and make atonement for him, because he sinned in regard to the corpse, and shall sanctify his head that same day. Isn't that interesting? He sinned regarding the corpse. Assuming we're going back to the guy who dropped dead right beside you, he sinned. You say, well, that's not really fair, is it? I mean, you can't control stuff like that. And so why do you think this law here in Numbers chapter 6 is so strict? What do you think God had in mind when he set this in motion?
Well, when I started this in the past, I always thought about it that way, but I don't think it has something to do with the hair, the length of the hair. The issue here is that God commanded that.
Yep.
Don't cut your hair.
Mm-hmm.
You could have said, don't give him a bath.
Mm-hmm.
But God is in command,
mm-hmm.
and whatever he tells us to do, if you don't, there's some consequences.
Sure. So this is more about obedience than anything, isn't it? if you want to separate yourself to my service, then this is what it's going to require. If you're going to take the Nazirite vow, you don't have to do that. This was something that was elective on the part of the individual. So it wasn't something that they were forced to do, other than Samson, and it wasn't something that they, could be drafted into. It was something they made a choice and said, "I will live by this." John?
Seems like a foreshadowing of what we go through as being Christians.
Okay, foreshadowing of what we go through as being Christians in trying to be holy, maintain our holiness, and all of those things. Maybe it's so strict because God wanted to demonstrate here in the Judges how hard it is to be faithful enough to save yourself. Because just living under these rules right here, that'd be hard, wouldn't it? Really hard. And maybe God is trying to say, look how hard it is to be a Nazirite. Just imagine if you had to earn your salvation. And the answer to that is you can't do that. You couldn't do that. And that's why when we get into the New Testament and Jesus comes, we have grace and mercy, why we should appreciate that more. Because if it wasn't for that, we would have to live this way and more strict if we had any hope of saving ourselves. Steve?
I think John brought out a good point. The Nazarites in this case were set apart.
Mm-hmm.
And the Greek word that we use for church of the New Testament literally means the set apart ones.
Yeah.
The ones who are set apart. So it fits perfectly with that.
Sure. Absolutely. It fits perfectly. Ecclesia, the called out ones, the separate ones, that's what we as the church are. And so we are to reflect. And again, I think in this case, the Nazirite was reflecting the holiness of God in their actions, just as we in the church should be reflecting the holiness of God in our actions. Janelle and then Marcia.
This may not have anything to do with what we're talking about, but if one day you have long hair and the next day it's shaved, then everybody knows that something has, or that period of service is over.
Sure. Yeah, you have a guy who's for 30 years maybe as a Nazirite, however long, and his hair has grown that long. And then all of a sudden the next day it's not. Either he sinned and had to shave it, or he's said, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. My time is over, and I'm not going to be a Nazirite anymore. And so it was an obvious thing. The hair was the way to recognize a Nazirite on sight. And while we don't have any specific identifying characteristics that we're Christians, other than how we live and how we speak and all of those things, we still have to reflect that holiness. And maybe it's a little more difficult for us because we can't just put a sign on our head and say, I'm a Christian. I guess you could, but we don't do that. And so we've got to reflect that holiness, just like this Nazirite reflected his vow or her vow in order to serve God. And again, we're not told what a Nazirite specifically did in that separation to God. Maybe it could be anything. Maybe he could set himself aside to do some particular task for a few years or multiple tasks. We just don't know. Marcia, you had a comment.
Well, I just feel like all of these rules and things that were in the Old Testament were there to make us appreciate the sacrifice that Christ made and what it allows us to try.
Sure, absolutely, and I think that's another one of the reasons why this is mentioned. We've got it good compared to ancient Israel as far as keeping rules. Do we have rules? Yes, we have rules. We understand that. But we know that we're saved by grace. And we know that if we do sin, Jesus is our advocate with the Father. And if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive our sins. And so that's a blessing we have, and we should appreciate that. Reading back on things like this and be thankful to God, we don't have to live that way. Savannah?
Two things. What Roberta was saying about the New Testament Nazarite, I looked it up in Acts 18:18.
Okay.
It talks about Paul having a vow where he cut his hair, but it doesn't describe it.
Okay.
Nazarite. And then other places in Acts 21, and it talks about there were 4 men who were under a vow.
Okay.
And so, but it doesn't specify specifically Nazarite.
So a couple couple of vows, could be Nazarite vow, especially with Paul not cutting his hair. That could be an inference we make from that. Very good. Go ahead.
The Nazarite vow originating from Nazareth, like we think about the mindset of the first century church, they would have still known the law and Pentateuch very well, and they would have had Torah class, so they would have known like that the Nazarite vow originated from Nazareth. And so then when Jesus came, originating from Nazareth, and they would say, nothing good comes from there. Their minds would have been automatically probably thinking about the vows that the Nazarites took and what it took for them to be pure and cleansed. And so then when Jesus came from Nazareth and him being like pure and cleansing others, just like takes them back to thinking the original readers of like, oh, these people who took the Nazarite vow had to do all of this just to be pure and cleansed, even if they were violent once. Yet Jesus like became pure and cleansed himself.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And that's interesting because you talk about, Steve was mentioning the continuity there. Nazarite, vow, city of Nazareth. There's so much connects in the Bible that if you think about it and pay attention, you see that. Glenn and then Ellen.
English Standard Version, in Numbers,
Mm-hmm.
it says, all the days of his vow of separation, no separation should come on the. And then he says, until the time is completed for which he separates himself. Was this just for a certain period of time?
Yeah, I think so. I think I don't know if it doesn't say, if they said, okay, I'm going to be a Nazarite for 6 months, year, 10 years, whatever. But it was obviously something they entered into of their own free will, and there was an end point for it. You could say, I suppose people could have been a Nazarite for life if they wanted to, but there could be an end point when you finish whatever that service is you were doing. Go ahead.
And it's interesting that whenever we're talking to Samson's mother, he says, shall eat no unclean thing. It sounds like maybe people were eating unclean thing.
Could be. Could be. And again, knowing what's gone on in Israel, how well are they keeping to those dietary laws that God had set up for them? Maybe they weren't at that point in time. And that was part of the issue. Oh, you had a comment.
Yeah, when I was younger, before we became a Baptist, I was a member of the Church of the Nazarene. And that's what they said. Jesus was a Nazarene, so therefore, that's what they founded their church on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, again, there's that continuity throughout Old and New Testament that we can't help but see. And that's why it says those things that were written before were written for our learning. So we better understand. You can understand the New Testament without the Old Testament, can't you? But you can understand it better with the Old Testament and more fully and more completely there. Flo?
Well, going back to another comment that hair was a symbol or indication of obedience and why they have to do certain things. Applying to us today, I think when we live a Christ-like life, I don't have to wear a banner or step a stamp on my forehead or carry the Bible every day of my life. I think people are going to know that something's different about my life. And that's what's important today. Yes, we can call it a symbol, whatever it is, but we don't have to have an arrogance about it. If we are Christ-like, we don't have to do those things.
It's obvious, isn't it? Yeah, people will know. They know something's different. May not know what is different about you, but they know something's different about you by the way you behave yourself and the way you conduct yourself. All right? Other thoughts, comments? Okay. One other thought that popped up while Savannah was talking. It took one violation of the Nazarite vow to nullify it all. And they had to start over, had to shave his head and start over if they wanted to do that and offer the offering. Doesn't that tell us the power of sin and how God feels about sin and why it says he hates sin? Because it's just one thing. And what is it James says? If you're guilty of one point of the law, you're what? Guilty of it all. And so as we think about that for our own modern lives, we have to understand sin's a bad thing. And yes, we all sin. We know that. And we ought to feel the weight of that sin. because we know that's what put Jesus on the cross. But at the same time, we have confidence to know that sin, there's a way now to take care of that sin that doesn't involve a yearly sacrifice at the temple. And so again, the crossover from Old Testament to New Testament is right there, and we understand it and can appreciate it. But maybe we need to always remember, we sometimes think, oh, it's just not that big a deal. Well, maybe not to me, but obviously to God it is. The one sin in the Garden of Eden, what happened? They got kicked out. Death came into the being. So that's how serious sin is and how serious God takes sin, which shows us why Jesus had to be sacrificed the way he did in order to take care of that big, big issue of sin. It took a big fix to fix sin, and there wasn't anything bigger than what Jesus did in order to save us from sin. All right? Thoughts, comments, questions? All right. You shall consecrate to the Lord the days of his separation. Bring a male lamb in the first year as a trespass offering, but the former days shall be lost because his separation was defiled. So again, do something that violates your vow, the whole thing's gone, and you gotta quit it and start over. Now this is the law of the Nazarite. When the days of his separation are fulfilled, he shall be brought to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. He shall present his offering to the Lord, one male lamb in its first year without blemish, as a burnt offering, one ewe lamb in its first year without blemish as a sin offering, one ram without blemish as a peace offering, a basket of unleavened bread, cake of fine flour mixed with oil, unleavened wafers anointed with oil, and their grain offering with their drink offering. That was just to quit being a Nazarite. And I find that interesting. Here's how I think it ought to work. If you separate yourself and do a real good job as a Nazarite, then the day you quit, you want to get something out of it. Not have to offer all these things. So why did the Nazarite have to offer all these things at the end of his separation? Other than the fact God told him that's what to do. What do you think? Janelle?
Well, perhaps the sacrifices were not so much for the person who had stopped as this is what God had said offered to me.
Mm-hmm.
So he's making the sacrifices to God for the accomplishment that has just been done.
He did his separation, however long that was, he or she, and then at the end of it, acknowledges God and God's holiness and God's righteousness and God's worthiness of being worshipped as his final act as a Nazarite. And so there's significance to that in the fact that, talk about going out with a bang. That's what they did when they quit being a Nazarite. They went out with a bang because it was all turned back towards God. And that's what we need to remember. Everything needs to be turned back to God. Everything goes back to God because without him, we're nothing. Savannah and then Steve.
I think a lot of it was about remembrance, because if you look at originally when the feast days were ordained and when they were commanded to do the different offerings, like God says, do this to remember the days that I want you to do. We'll do this to remember this. And you can see when they stop having the feast and we stop giving offerings, and they forget God's faithfulness. And so I think a lot of the times when sometimes our mindset is, oh, they had to give all these offerings and it was just rote, just doing these commands to get them done. But in God's mind, he knew that they needed those acts of remembrance. And so at the end of their Nazarite vow, they would have been remembering, oh, God's faithfulness in doing this, and God's character in this situation, and remembering the whole Nazarite vow.
Sure. So it's about remembrance, about remembering what had been done during that period he was a Nazarite, remembering the Passover, they came out of Egypt, all of those things, remembering the Feast of Tabernacles, that they lived in tents for all those years. There was a memory purpose for all of these things, not just a command that God said, oh, you do this, and you do this, and you do this. They all had a reason behind them. It wasn't just a blind command that God gave and said, do this, but there was something in it for us or them at the time to remember. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, remember, right? Remember. And so the same is true for us. It's not just about taking juice and that little, whatever that wafer is we get. I suppose it's unleavened bread, but it looks like styrofoam to me. Anyway, we remember the body, we remember the blood, because that's part of it, and that seems to be maybe what's going on here. And notice, a lamb without blemish. Isn't that a constant throughout Old and New Testament? Jesus was a what? A lamb without blemish. And again, it all fits together. It all works together in that. Steve, you got a comment?
Yes, well, I was back to the comparison with Christianity. Who is the debtor in the relationship?
Mm-hmm.
Who's the one who receives the blessing? The blessing is not to God that they are Nazarite. They are the recipients of the blessing from God. I think that's, it's part of their service. This separation is part of their obligation to show God their appreciation.
Yeah.
And respect, like you.
Yeah. We are in debt because of our sin and because of the salvation offered by Jesus. He paid a debt he did not owe. I owed a debt I could not pay. We sing that song every once in a while from our hymnal, and it's true. We're in debt, and we need to acknowledge that debt and remember that debt, because we all benefit from that debt. And when we give praise to God for that, we're just acknowledging that He's the one who saw that would happen and could happen and should happen. And so it's a reminder for us. And so it was a sacrifice that they made at the end of the Nazirite vow. Then the priest shall bring them before the Lord and offer his sin offering and his burnt offering. And he shall offer the ram as a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord, with a basket of unleavened bread. And the priest shall also offer its grain offering and its drink offering. Then the Nazirite shall shave his consecrated head at the door of the temple, tabernacle of meeting, and shall take the hair from his consecrated head and put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offering. So again, once it's over, cuts his hair off, puts it in the fire as the final symbol, I guess, of I'm offering the sign of my Nazirite vow back to God. And he then would go back to his normal life doing, we assume, whatever it was he wanted to do at that point in time. And the priest shall take the boiled shoulder of the ram, one unleavened cake from the basket, one unleavened wafer, and put them upon the hands of the Nazirite after he has shaved his consecrated hair. And the priest shall wave them as a wave offering before the Lord. They are holy for the priest, together with the breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the heave offering. And after that, the Nazirite may drink wine. So in other words, goes back to pre-Nazirite state. He can go back to doing what he wanted to do before that. Eat grapes, raisins, juice, all that stuff. Cut his hair when he wants to, and all of that. But not during that very specific time when he was to be a Nazirite. This is the law of the Nazirites, who vows to the Lord the offering for his separation, and besides that, whatever else his hand is able to provide, according to the vow which he takes, so he must do according to the law of his separation. And that just, again, that kind of wraps it up. Nazirites are mentioned a couple of times later, Lamentations 4 and verse 7, and Amos chapter 2. And we'll get into those, just point out those are a couple more times the Nazirites are mentioned. Or as Savannah pointed out, there were vows in the New Testament not called Nazirite vow, but Paul sounds very much like that because he didn't cut his hair in that process. So it could have been that as well. We just simply don't know. All right, any comments about Nazirites before we move on? So the woman came and told her husband, saying, a man of God came to me, and his countenance was like the countenance of an angel of God, very awesome. But I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name. And he said to me, behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now drink no wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb to the day of his death. Then Manoah prayed to the Lord and said, O my Lord, please let the man whom you sent come to us again, and teach us what we shall do for this child who will be born. So, Samson was appointed as a Nazirite in the womb, or before he was in the womb even. He was going to be a Nazirite, and it says there, all the days of his life. To the day he died, he was a Nazirite. This one was a lifelong commitment that God had put on Samson. And his parents, them, are concerned. Well, how does this work? Come back and teach us what we need to do in order to make this happen. because they didn't want to do anything that would violate it. They probably knew the Nazarite law as well as anybody did, and so they realized that we need somebody to instruct us in how this works. Again, how far away from a dead body should he be, if there is one? What's the distance? Maybe that was some of the questions they had. How far away do you have to be, or things of that nature? How far do you have to stay from a vineyard, if that's the case, or whatever? So maybe they're concerned. They want to do this right. They recognize God's been with them, and they want to do right, so they're asking questions. Help us know what to do. And isn't that a good thing to ask of God? Help us to know what to do. And we obviously have the Word for that, and His help in that process. What shall we do for the child who will be born? And God listened to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman as she was sitting in the field. But Manoah, her husband, was not with her. Then the woman ran in haste and told her husband and said to him, "Look, the man who came to me the other day just now appeared to me." So Manoah rose and followed his wife, and when he came to the man, he said, "Are you the man who spoke to this woman?" And he said, "I am." And Manoah said, "Now let your word come to pass. What will the boy's rule of life? What will be the boy's rule of life in his work?" So again, clarifying everything that they had been told earlier, the idea of him being a Nazarite, what's going to be his rules, what's going to be his work, what's he going to do. We want to know all of that so they can do their part in preparing him for that role. And the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, "Of all that I say to the woman, let her be careful. She may not eat anything that comes from the vine, nor may she drink wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean. All that I commanded her, let her observe." Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, "Please let us detain you, and we will prepare a young goat for you." And the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, "Though you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you offer a burnt offering, you must offer it to the Lord." For Manoah did not know he was the angel of the Lord. And then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, "What is your name? And when your words come to pass, we may honor you." And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful?" And so, again, just a further clarification of what's going on. Manoah wanted answers. He wanted to know things. What's your name? What do we need to do? And there's nothing wrong in the sense of that. But the angel wouldn't give his name unless you think that maybe when it says seeing it is wonderful, maybe that was his name. Some people have argued that maybe that is his name, but we don't know. The text simply doesn't say, and it sounds probably like he didn't tell him his name. It's a wonderful name, maybe too wonderful for you to know. Bob?
I don't think that they were truly getting that this was an angel of the Lord. They
Yeah.
were looking at it as a wise man, telling them what's to come to pass. But I don't think they fully understood what was going on.
Yeah, I think you're right. And as we go on here, so Manoah took the young goat, the grain offering, and offered on the rock of the Lord, and did a wonderful, wondrous thing while Manoah and his wife looked on it. As it happened, the flames went up toward heaven from the altar. The angel of the Lord ascended in the flames on the altar. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell on their faces to the ground. It's like, this is when they get it. Wow. When the angel of the Lord appeared no more, Manoah said to his wife, and then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord. And so they didn't quite get it all until this point in time when they made that offering. And wow, we have been in the presence of the angel of the Lord. Manoah said to his wife, "We shall surely die because we've seen God." But his wife said to him, "If the Lord had desired to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hand, nor would he have shown us all these things, nor would he have told us such things as these at this time." So the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him in Mahanaim, between Mahanaim, between Zorah and Eshtaol. So Samson's finally on the scene. He's born as a Nazarite. He's going to live as a Nazarite, but he's not going to live as a Nazarite because he's going to violate that vow on numerous occasions, which we'll get to as we talk more about this his life. All right, questions, comments, thoughts.
It seems impossible to live that.
Yeah,
It just seems impossible.
yeah, and again, back to our earlier point, I think that's the point of it. It's impossible for me to live good enough to be saved on my own merit. It just can't be done. If there was ever a law that could have saved humanity, that was the Old Testament law. And Israel couldn't do it. From the very beginning, they had a hard time doing all those things. And so it points out for us in the New Testament why Jesus' sacrifice was so necessary, why it was needed, because that was the only way that sin could be taken care of. Because I can't do it, you can't do it, collectively we can't do it, because we can't be good enough, because all sin and fall short of the glory of God. And that's just the fact of the matter. And thankfully, we live in a time when Jesus' sacrifice and his blood covers us. And we don't have to be separated from God. Flo?
Yeah, but Jesus told us, why you call me Lord, Lord, you do what I said.
Right. Yeah, and there's still obedience there. And you know, we talk about compared to Old Testament law and all of its requirements versus what's required under the New Testament, which is harder? I might argue that it's harder living under New Testament rules than it is maybe the Old Testament. Because so much of it involves my attitude, my mindset, the condition of my heart, and all of that I've got to be thinking about. Whereas Israel had a checklist, basically. Got to do this, got to do this, got to do this, got to do this, got to do this. And so as long as they did their checklist, they were doing pretty well. God still wanted their heart to be in it, but at least they had that I would say freedom of knowing what God was expecting of them. All right? We're out of time. We'll pick up there, Lord willing, next week and continue on. Thank you.